a really simple sounding question that I want to make a little more complex as we talk. And that is, what is policy? I'm going to focus particularly on education policy, but a lot of the background for what I'm going to talk about right now is outside of education policy solely. It comes to a certain extent from political science and other domains, but really this very simple question, what is policy, I find sometimes confuses people. They don't want to think that or they might think that I have sort of a hidden agenda or sort of a trick question to pose to them, because of course policy is just sort of one of those words that we tend to think is very simple. But I want to sort of challenge that notion a little bit, and I'll do that by giving what I think the best notion or definition of policy is, and that comes from David Easton from 1953. He defines policy as the authoritative allocation of values. Now, this is a really complex definition. It's the reason I love it, because it's also very, very concise. But it turns our attention about policy in particularly important ways. So, for instance, take that word authoritative. Policy is made by people who have the authority to do so. So, if you think of something as simple as, your policies for when your child should come home from being out on the town, right? Your child isn't the one that dictates what their curfew is. It's parents, generally speaking, who will dictate as the authority within the family when the policy is for when a child has to come home. So really, this notion of authority focuses us on the who of policy making. Only certain people have the ability to actually create policy and enforce policy. Allocation. Not only are the authorities the people that have the power to make policy, but they, in some senses, distribute the policy. So it's something that they sort of impose, not necessarily in a solely negative sense, but they impose that policy on others. Some people are the subjects of a particular policy, and how they have a number of means in which they can actually do the allocating of those values. It can be through text, it can be through media, it can be through funding, money talks, right? So lots of ways that authority can be allocated. And it's not just anything that's being allocated. It's not just sort of a set of rules, but really underlying the rules that a policy represents is a set of values. So it's a particular people's set of values that's being allocated authoritatively. Now, when Easton talks about values, he's talking about things that are both material and more abstract or symbolic. So a set of values could be anything that a particular society values, or particular culture values. But I want to focus a bit on the symbolic part, because I think it undergirds some of the things that I talk about in some of my policy work, which is that those people who are in authority are not always, they don't always possess the same values that the subjects of a policy might have. So that conflicting of values sets up power dynamics in particularly complex ways. Some people are the winners of policy, and some people are the losers of policy. And oftentimes, the losers of policy are not the same people that are the sort of authorities creating that policy. So that's one particular definition of policy. But if we also think about policy in a slightly different way, I want to think about policy as both text and discourse. Okay, now discourse not in the sort of simple sense of two people talking together, but discourse in the Foucauldian sense of system of values that's being sort of communicated through language. Now, at the same time, of course, it's important to think about the material part of a policy. There is an actual text of a policy, generally speaking. Sometimes it's just verbal, but oftentimes, in the more formal sense of policy, it's actually written down. And it's important to think about the text part of it because there's, as it says here, a process of interpretation and translation of policy that school actors go through to enact policy, right? So the authorities that are creating a policy are creating a text, and they are trying to pose that text in a way that is read in a very specific way. They have a specific meaning that they want to try to get across. But the people who receive policy, who have to implement the policy, also have to do an interpretation and translation of that policy to be able to put it in place. And sometimes those two interpretations go in wildly different directions. The people who are having to enact a policy don't always necessarily understand exactly what it was that the people who are legislating the policy are intending. So that's policy as a text, but policy is also discourse. And so let me try to explain that a little bit. This is, again, using Foucault's sense of what discourse is. So it's the ways in which teacher subjects and subject positions are formed and reformed by policy, and the ways that teachers are invited to speak, listen, act, read, work, think, feel, behave, and value in particular and specific ways. So again, this gets to the value part of Easton's definition, in that the policy kind of creates people, right? It forms who those policy people are. It defines the roles that they can take within it, right? So if you are subject to a policy, you are constrained, you are invited to think in particular ways about whatever the subject happens to be in that policy. It invites you to, as it says here, speak, listen, act, read, work, think, feel, behave, and value in particular ways. So if we think, for instance, of my work on boys' education policy in Australia, the policy that was being created by the Australian government was in some senses trying to create what a real boy is, what a good boy is, a right boy, to define what appropriate masculinity is. And it's trying to create for teachers and administrators who are trying to implement this policy particular ways of thinking about boys, ways that they can speak about boys, and in fact creating things like an economic system that creates this understanding of boys and how they should be treated by teachers. So in thinking about policy as discourse, this is an important way of thinking. So it's not just that there's a text that gives rules, but it also sort of gives you ways of being and validating who can speak and the ways in which they can speak as well. So once we understand kind of a basic definition of policy, both as a kind of authoritative allocation of values, but also sort of taking place as text and as a discourse, let's think something pretty simple, like where does policy actually happen? Well, there's lots of levels of policy. There's sort of a worldwide level, a transnational level. So you can think of policy as something like UN policy. There are policies like education for all, a number of different multilateral, multinational agreements that have touched on how education should proceed worldwide. And that has sort of authority in that things that are valued can come through those particular policies, like a notion of fairness and justice, including gender justice, including poverty justice, those kinds of things. And oftentimes, donors will actually tie donations to whether or not a country has signed on to a UN policy. So donor aid might be one of the values that's being transmitted as well. So there is a kind of international level at which policy happens. There's frequently also a national level. So, for instance, in the U.S., there are national education policies that are passed by Congress, that are implemented by the Department of Education and other branches. Things like the CDC, for instance, has certain educational policies that are in place that it has some responsibilities for. Now, not every country has national level policies. If we go just north of the border, for instance, to Canada, almost exclusively education is a provincial responsibility, and so there are no real sort of national level policies. Within the U.S., we might think of policy also happening at the state level. And in fact, constitutionally speaking, education is actually a right that is given to the states, not to the federal government, which has caused quite a bit of conflict over the years between policy responsibilities in terms of who is the authority that can make those policies at the state and local levels. So, if you just look at 3 states like North Dakota, Texas, and South Carolina, those have very different kinds of policies on various aspects of education. Everything from how education will be funded, to how school lunches will be funded, to what sort of curriculum, what sort of tests will be given in schools, all those kinds of things. Each one has its own state level, like higher education policies and all those kinds of things. So a lot of educational policy making actually happens at the state level. You can also have a sort of more local level at which policy happens. So, for instance, if we look inside of Texas, if we look at Houston, there might be Houston-specific education policies for that particular school district. Now, Houston has a very large school district. Other large cities might split theirs into individual school districts, and each school district may have different policies about curriculum, about hiring, about janitorial services. Any of those kinds of things can be sort of the subject of policy. Within a particular locale, you might have one school that has policies. Individual policies that schools create could include things like dress codes. How many inches above the knee can a girl's skirt be? Things like lunchroom policies that a school might create. And even within a school, individual classrooms can have policies. So, an individual teacher might have a homework policy. If you don't turn in your homework, you take 5% off your grade, or, if you're late for class, you have to do push-ups, or whatever the policy happens to be. It can be at a very, very kind of localized level. And just so long as it's, there's an authority who's allocating particular values. So in the homework instance, the teacher has authority to record grades and, record your final assessment and whether or not you pass on to the next grade. They are allocating this authority through, the homework policy and through the grading practices, those kinds of things. And the value, of course, will be the actual grade itself, the points that you get towards, achievement in school. So it can happen at almost any level. So policies really, they surround us within our own families, within our schools, within our workplaces, within local government, state governments, all the way up through international levels. Now, historically, there's kind of a traditional view of how policy is created. So we want to think about how is it that policy comes together. So yes, there's an authoritative allocation of values, but how does that actually take place process-wise? The most traditional way of thinking about it is as stages. And those stages go something like, you identify a problem that the policy is going to cover. You research solutions to that particular problem, whether it's trying to see what other people have tried to do, best practices in the field, those kinds of things. You then formulate the actual policy based on the research that you've done into possible solutions. You implement the policy by sort of distributing it to whoever is supposed to actually, be in charge of implementing. And then you evaluate the outcomes of the policy. So did you actually achieve the goals that you had for solving the particular problem? And of course, that all then sort of starts over. So this kind of cyclical view of discrete independent stages of creating a policy. Now, as you might be able to guess, it's not usually that simple. Anybody who's actually been involved in creating policies can almost invariably tell you lots of different ways in which, some stages might get dropped altogether. Some you might have to sort of restart the process all over again before you even get to implementation, and the evaluation might not go well because you've got the wrong outcomes that you're looking for, or you can't collect the data, or lots of ways in which this is a much messier process of creating policy. So I want to show you kind of a couple of alternatives. One is Johnson's cultural circuit model. This one is interesting to think of policy with. It wasn't created specifically to look at policy, but policies are a kind of cultural product, so it can kind of fit in here. So you can think of the production of texts as being kind of caught in these conditions of public representations versus private representations. So in other words, a document can be produced either by private people or very publicly. Generally speaking, with policies, we're talking about a more public representation. That production results in particular texts which have particular forms. And those texts get read. We mentioned earlier that the teachers will take a particular educational policy and have to read and interpret them in terms of their actual textual representation. And those readings happen in various conditions, from abstract, universal kind of readings to concrete, particular type of readings. Those readings then get translated into lived cultures and social relations. So in other words, you can read a policy in a particular way, but then once you put it into an actual school where people are interacting and resisting or accepting enthusiastically, whatever the case happens to be, but all sorts of kind of social processes go on in trying to actually do the policy itself, and then that loops back around to producing yet more policies. Now, this cultural circuit model does create an extra layer of complexity, I think, because it does take into account these conditions and these contexts for both producing and reading and enacting policies. So this is a really interesting one to think of that gets us beyond this very simple, straightforward, linear model that we showed on the last slide where it goes in stages. My own work on thinking about policy as ecology, and this comes from educational researcher, an article I wrote called An Ecology Metaphor for Educational Policy Analysis. This is actually a representation right out of my work with the boys' education policy in Australia. And what you'll see here is a sense of looking at levels of policy, much like I was talking about a few slides back, where there's kind of a global transnational level. There's a national level, and for the Australian part, there is both kind of a federal level and a state level that you can see going on here. There's the media, there's researchers and academics. There's so many actors that are actually part of the policy process that it's almost too simple to kind of think in terms of stages, because each stage is just absolutely overrun by different groups with different interests and different relationships with each other that can inflect policies in really complex ways. And of course, all of those relationships and interactions are kind of filtered through, if you will, by different ideologies, the histories of a particular context, the economy in a particular place, cultural norms and mores, if there's particular public concern about what the issue is. So in the United States, for instance, many people are really very concerned about healthcare policy, but not all that concerned about traffic policy, unless you happen to live in a place where it's the traffic is very bad. But in general, our roads and bridges is not something that there's a huge public outcry and lots of articles being written about. Of course, any kind of policy process has to contend with previous policies that are already on the books. It has to take account of government structures and the ways in which a policy has to proceed through those government structures. And of course, there's dynamics of race, class, and gender, in addition to many other sort of identity politics, if you will, that have to be considered when policy is being made, or that play a role in how a policy gets made. So there are definitively raced, classed, and gendered policies, and oftentimes those are actually intersectional in their influence on particular policies. So you can kind of see that as we look more closely at the policy process, that it's not quite so simple as being able to say that there's just stages that a particular policy can go through. In addition to the different ways of understanding how policy is made and making it more complex over time as we theorize policy, there are lots of different ways that you can describe policy and different policy types or different policy effects. This work comes from Taylor, Risby, Lingard, and Henry, but there are a number of other sort of typologies out there that talk about how to differentiate policies. One way you can think about it is as either distributive or redistributive. So in distributive policies, there's kind of a straightforward allocation of resources. So everybody gets something. So for instance, you'd have something like tax policy where everybody can take a deduction on their sort of personal income, right? So this is a policy that distributes something to everybody, very straightforward. So it's not means tested, in other words. Now that's in contrast to a more redistributive policy where particular groups are targeted to get certain benefits of the policy. So for instance, you might have a policy that is for Native American tribes, so that particular resources are sent to Native American tribes rather than other groups, because perhaps they have more need in a particular area than another group. You can also think of policy as symbolic versus material. Symbolic would be, broad, vague, unfunded statements of belief. So a policy about, flying the American flag at a particular district's schools, right? That's a very symbolic policy that doesn't necessarily have funding to it. Like, in other words, they may not buy your flag for you to fly at and stuff, but that it's sort of more of a statement of beliefs about patriotism and nationalism and those kinds of things. Or something like lots of national holidays that we have, right? So there's National Agriculture Month or something like that. I'm not sure if there actually is one of those, but that's more of a symbolic kind of policy to say that we ought to give thanks for or give respect to agriculture as a particular social good. Material policies, on the other hand, are where we take those things that are less symbolic and actually distribute them. So things like money, things like materials, other sorts of resources like labor, time, those kinds of things. Those would be policies that are funded, specific, and oftentimes have a much sort of more easier implementation to them, because there's an actual something that is getting moved from one place to another. We can also think about policy as rational versus incremental. So in a rational policy, there'd be kind of prescriptive stages in implementation. So stage one would be that everybody gets a kitchen built in their school. Stage two is that, everybody will get serving utensils sent to their school. Stage three is that everybody gets trained, and then, so there's kind of a building over time that goes on for incremental, but it's incremental in the sense of that each policy is going to be followed by a different policy. So in a rational policy, there's very much, like, these are the things that X group of people must do in order for this to get implemented. Incremental, on the other hand, is sort of creating new policies in a series to get those put together. And there's substantive policies versus more procedural policies. These are not mutually exclusive, by the way. So when I say versus, I don't mean that you can only be one or the other. There can be blending of all of these different policy descriptions. But so for substantive policy, it's really about what government intends to do, broadly speaking. Procedural is much more, how things are to be done specifically. So in substantive, it would be, here's our general intention to decrease the number of high school dropouts, right? That's sort of a substantive policy in terms of like what they intend to do. Procedural would be more like, how, specifically speaking, each individual school district has to get a school dropout coordinator, and each school district has to put in place a program on preventing dropouts, those kinds of things. That would be a much more procedural type of policy, laying out those things specifically. Then there's regulatory versus deregulatory. Regulatory practices or policies obviously would be much more controlling, so putting rules in place. Deregulatory, on the other hand, is sort of minimizing government intervention by sort of taking away rules and specific outcomes and metrics that have to be met and things like that. And of course, there's policy that is top-down. In other words, it's developed by administrators or legislators or governments, and then sort of distributed down, if you will, to schools and teachers, versus bottom up, which is actually developed by practitioners. So it would be a policy where teachers would actually create the policy interventions and different practices that would be put in place. So that's a sense of what different types of policies can be described, the different characteristics that they may have. And again, there are a number of other typologies that you can look to for how to describe policies, but this is one that I think is particularly effective.